And good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon, everybody who's online as well. So I got into finding out things about rope making because I ring church bells. Mending and repairing bell ropes is something which is often necessary. And what we're going to do as a result of bringing church bells, we also had a project run from the Mancroft Ringing Discovery Centre at St Peter Mancroft Church in Norwich, where we went out to schools and did some ringing related activities. And one of the things that I introduced into the scheme was actually doing a bit of rope making. Not that ringers normally make their own ropes, but it's just fun. And the young people seem to enjoy it. Three main parts to what I'll be doing. First of all, just looking at how rope itself is made. Then a bit of a look at Norfolk as a whole, but very quick sketch there. And then dive into Yarmouth and Norwich. So that's roughly the order of proceedings. The Encyclopedia Britannica here, it shows a long rope walk. And one of the things about making rope is you've got to go long and straight. You can't go round corners. We've got a couple of lads here. They're dressed like little Lord Fauntleroy for some reason. It also, the rope walk stretching into the distance looks a bit like a rose arbor, which I'm pretty sure is not how most rope walks really were. So the actual structure of a rope. You begin with fibers, and those fibers may be natural. These days, obviously, many synthetic fibers are used. The fibers are then spun to make your yarn, and then the yarns combine to make strands, and the whole lot of strands combine to make the rope. Strictly speaking, a rope should have a circumference of more than an inch. Anything else is a line or a twine or something like that. And cordage is the generic term for the things that we're seeing made. The other term that you may come across is cables. So you make three ropes, you twist your three ropes together, and that gives you a cable. Now, this particular cable from Mary Rose, it's a slightly dark brown color because the fibers would have been tarred before the rope was made. And this particular piece, I have seen it, and you can still smell the tar. Main fiber that was used kind of from Roman times through to the end of the 19th century is hemp or Cannabis sativa. The fibers grow up the outside of the plant. The structure of cannabis is much like nettles, and also flax yarn is used for linen is the same. You've got a woody core, you've got to get the fibers off the outside, and there's a bit of a process involved in doing that. Having got to your fibers, the next thing is you've got to start doing things with it. Now, P.H. Emerson, very famous photographer, I hope that those of you who know things about Norfolk know about him. And here we've got somebody spinning, so he has hooked his yarn onto the hook above the wheel. If we look hard, there's a young lad behind there, a wheel boy. And his job was to turn the wheel. If you had an apprenticeship as a rope maker, that's how you'd start. Long, hard days of work. And if we go over to the right-hand side of the photograph, you can see there's another thing in the corner, which is a rope jack. And that is what would be used when you've got your yarns there. You then start putting them together to make the whole rope. And this is the second one of the pictures in the set. The book, The Wildlife Under Tidal Water, I went and read it, and unfortunately, it just says, and the photographs speak for themselves, because I hoped to find out more information about who and where exactly they were. But it was in Yarmouth because Emerson and Thomas Goodall had an expedition on a barge on a houseboat on Breydon Water. So the hooks are there to keep the yarn out of the dirt. Very skilled physical work. It's, you know, the touch is all in the fingers. I really can't, not something I've ever really tried. Here's another picture of showing some rope making, this time in Diss. Now, the caption says Dobson and Co. rope spinners Diss. Dobson moved to Diss. Well, he was in the 1911 census. In the 1901 census, he was in Haverhill, where there was a rope works, and he worked as a rope maker in Haverhill. He came to Diss, but you can see it's open air, pretty rudimentary. If we zoom in a bit there, you can see a shelter, a couple of bits of wood and a bit of canvas over the top. So this kind of helps to explain why not much has survived from the point of view of rope making around, because once people had stopped doing it, there were no big structures there to keep in place. So very simple, very primitive. And he was, say, 1911, he was in Diss. He moved to Leighton in Essex, probably about 1917. Now, simple demonstration of how rope is made, and came to the archive a couple of weeks ago, and we set up a demonstration so that people who are online in particular could see what happens. And we've got the same number of pieces of yarn going to each hook. So we've got 3 hooks at this end of the rope walk, and then a cranked handle, which is going to turn the 3 hooks at the same time. And we didn't have a wheel boy, so Victoria kindly stepped in. And we can see as the twisting's going on, the strands are starting to form. Down at the other end, we've got just 1 hook, and you can see there's a lot of energy in there, a lot of twist. They're all trying to undo themselves. And that force of trying to undo themselves, we can put to good use, because the hook at this end, the single hook, is on a swivel. So those strands trying to undo themselves, they're enough to twist the swivel, and then it twists round and makes the rope. This should be a nice conical thing called a top, but it's just to keep the strands separate. And just like that, the whole rope comes together. It's really a fairly easy process. Down here, we started off, that bottle was on the floor when we started, and you can see how much the things have shrunk as we've been winding. Pretty hairy. We could rub it with something slightly abrasive to get the hair off. I have seen people do it with a blowtorch, but that apparently wasn't welcome at the archive for very good reasons. And if you look very closely, you may be able to see down here that the strands, the lines in the strands are going one way, but the lines in the rope are going the opposite way, which shows that the strand and the rope, they're twisted in opposite directions. Now, a couple of pictures. The top picture is from the French encyclopedia. The bottom one is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. But if we turn the French round, then the 2 bits, the 2 drawings match as to what's going on. One end is fixed, the other end has to move, because as you wind things up, so the rope gets shorter. So we've got 3 cranks. So we show 3 people winding the 3 cranks. This is how it was done manually. In the middle, there's a carriage which has got a top on it, which is connected, which is where the strands come in and they emerge at the other side, made into the rope. The people standing about in the middle, kind of leading into the rope, their job is to try and transmit the twist along the rope, because it could have a long way to go. A rope walk like this, the building could be 400 yards long, quarter of a mile. So there's a long way for that twist to go. And at the bottom end, where it says moving, there's a sledge there with weight on it, which gets dragged forward as the rope gets shorter. And by putting more or less weight on it, you can adjust how tight the rope gets twisted. We're showing just sort of a couple of people on each stage of the process there, but you could, on the biggest cables that they made in the dockyards, you could have 100 people involved in closing a single cable. So pretty labor intensive for really big ropes. This is the inside of a big rope walk. This is the historic dockyard in Chatham. If you've never been, I thoroughly recommend that you go. And this is how the process looks in reality. So you've got machinery at each end doing the twisting. You don't have loads and loads of men. And the top cart is moving along. You can see there's a nice conical top there. The strands coming in from the left, the rope emerging at the back of the top. And those rope tails that are wound around, they are there to control how fast the top goes down the rope walk. If the chap who was guiding it let go, that top would just go down the rope walk all by itself. There was nothing as big or magnificent as that in Norfolk. Where there was machinery, it may well have been something on this sort of scale. This came out of the rope works in Haverhill. The photograph there is at the museum in Stowmarket. I'm not sure what's on display at Stowmarket anymore now. They changed it into a food museum rather than the Museum of East Anglian Life or whatever. But you can see on the top, there are a couple of tops. And those tops are joined together by a stick. That means you could have two sets side by side being twisted, and you could go along and close two ropes at the same time. So machinery on that sort of scale may well have been around in Norfolk. Now, I expect many of you are familiar with trade directories. So in trade directories, we find lists of where people are making rope and what they're doing. This is a list for Norwich. And if we look around at where we find people listed, so go around the Norfolk coast, go around the coast. So you've got Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth. Lots of people in Yarmouth. Then Sheringham, Cromer, Wells, right over to King's Lynn. So they would be making things mainly for ships. The inland people, obviously, you've got agriculture, farming. That needs some other specialisms. So plough lines, which need to be tapered, harnesses and things like that, which need to be made. So and in Germany, you've actually got you had two different apprenticeships for whether you were somebody who made rope for ships or whether you made rope for agriculture. So let's have a quick look at Yarmouth. Now, to understand Yarmouth, you need to understand the wall. Very important. If you've not had a walk around the wall in Yarmouth, definitely worth doing. So to get some bearings, we've got St. Nicholas Church, now the Minster, old photo there when it had a spire. In the middle, we've got St. George's Chapel, which is now the theatre, and St. Peter's Church, which is now the Greek Orthodox. And on the maps, the north varies on the next lot of maps as to which direction it's in. That little bump, the Chapel Mount or the Bastion, is a useful landmark. So here we've got Hayden's map. There's the parish church. There's St. George's. There's the Chapel Bastion. St. Peter's Church hadn't yet been built. Now this blue shaded area originally didn't have buildings in it. The idea was that when the wall was there as a defense, if you threw something incendiary over the top, to set fire to the town. So that was kept clear. Convenient area for the rope makers to work in Yarmouth, which is where they were. However, things change. The town grows. The wall is no longer necessary as a defense. And so the corporation clears the rope makers out, and those red lines, they show where the rope walks went outside the wall. And even to make life a bit more convenient for people, a gate there known as the rope maker's gate which is now actually the site of St. Peter's Church, was put in so people could get in and out more easily. Yarmouth's got some lovely maps. This one, so a map of the estates, the property of the mayor, aldermen, burgesses, and commonalty of the borough of Great Yarmouth in the county of Norfolk, and of their waste called the Deans. So an 1826 map, and this was the corporation mapping their property. As you can see, it's pretty big, 240 inches, that's 20 feet long. And there's a book of reference that goes with it, which was a reference to the sites and who was who had the leases. Fortunately, there's a smaller scale version bound as a book, so it's half the scale of the big map. So this map's at a scale of 2 chains to the inch. If you recollect how long a chain is, 22 yards. Very, very nicely produced maps and book. So here we are. This time, north is in that direction to the right as you're looking at the screen, and the sea is at the bottom of the map. And we've just got the area outside the wall. It doesn't show inside the wall. There's the chapel bastion in this section. All of these blue lines, they are all rope walks. And so you can see good number of rope walks there. There were other rope walks in other areas of town, but this was the most densely packed bit. So that bit there, to give you an idea, is 240 yards long. And the longer ones would have been about 400 yards, about a quarter of a mile long. And you may be able to see on the plots on the map, there are some numbers, and these numbers were tallied by the corporation, so they knew who'd got the lease on each bit. So lots of little narrow plots there. And if we go back to our Emerson picture, then we've got an idea there of the narrow strips that people had. Along the side here, you've got posts to identify the edge of each of the rope walks. Rope makers' posts, something that crops up commonly because people, rope makers setting out their posts could be a bit of an obstruction. Also, you see the tar barrels and nets hanging up. So almost certainly the person here making it was a net, must have been a net maker, I would think. And there under the arrow, I think that's another person working on the next lane over. Now, my wife did say to me, I'm going to show them lots of places where rope walks aren't anymore. And pretty much, yes. So this is Blackfriars Road in Great Yarmouth. It's the car park that's outside Time and Tide. And we know that William Norfolk had a shed and twine ground in this area from the map and the notebook. And 1881 census, Robert Woodhouse, twine spinner employing 4 men and 3 boys. So the boys were very much an important part of the staff. Looking at it from the other side, here's the Ordnance Survey map, and there's the rope walk shown on the Ordnance Survey map. The buildings shown on the map there, they've disappeared. They probably ended about where that grey fence is at the edge of the blue shading. So, rope walks, lots of them. If we zoom in a bit onto our little corner we were looking at and overlay the historic map onto the modern one, one of the things that becomes apparent is that Yarmouth at this point is pretty narrow. That is about half a mile down to the edge of the sea, more or less. And so Yarmouth is growing the waste known as the Denes is now a prime site for development. Very curious how lots of members of the Yarmouth Corporation seem to have interests in that area. There are all the rope walks that we mentioned earlier on the map. And if you're trying to go north-south in Yarmouth, so the road nearer the sea there, that's kind of Marine Parade, if you know your Yarmouth. You've got the rope walks in the way. There was a story of a lady getting very fed up with being obstructed by rope making going on. She tried to duck underneath the rope as it was being made, got her hair caught in the rope. And one remedy on offer was that she could have had a pretty severe haircut then and there. But what the rope makers did very kindly was they wrapped her skirts around her and then lifted her up and twisted her around and twisted her around until her hair became untangled. And so in 1857, the rope walks, which have caused such great annoyance to the inhabitants of and visitors to the town, are shortly to be removed to the Monument Denes near the asylum. So the Monument Denes, that's down where the Nelson Monument is, that direction. And the asylum, of course, was the Naval Hospital. So rope walks get moved, and this new site, the Red Line, just to the west of the Naval Hospital, that's where the new rope walk site was. A couple of vestigial red lines at the top. There were a couple of bits, including the Blackfriars Road one that I mentioned, which survived. Here it is on the Ordnance Survey map. So there's the big rope walk, big long site. There's actually another rope walk up there as well. So all's hunky-dory. Town planning has done its job. It's got the rope walks out of the way, much more convenient for people. Well, nearly, because some of the residents who lived along Ordnance Road just there complained bitterly that Newcastle Road was now blocked off by the rope walks. They wanted to get to the pubs on the South Quay, and they were not able to do so. So not everybody was completely happy. If we look at it on the big map, the older map, they carried on updating this map, even though it originally was from 1826. So the top bit, the rope walk is leased to Robert Barber, the bottom one to John T. Bracey, and already the one in the middle, it was leased to somebody called Lettice, but no longer. So changes are afoot. That is the site where the rope walk was. If you know Yarmouth, just to the left, just out of the picture on the left would be the gasometer. The church on the right is St. James's Church, a later church. While St. James's Church was being built, the Sunday school was happening on Bracey's rope walk nearby, because Bracey was somebody who was involved in the building of the church. But now in the modern picture, you can see that Newcastle Road is no longer blocked off by the rope walks, and you can go along Newcastle Road to get to any pubs that may be left on the South Quay. They were making things like fishing warps here. So those would be 120 fathoms long, which in yards is, nobody knows, 240 yards thereabouts, among the cordage that was made on the site. They were long warps that were fixed to drift nets, and each boat might need about 12 of those. So you needed good long sites to be able to make that sort of cordage. Going behind the site as it is now, there's a row of flats along there. Interesting though, they made the flats, but I think it's nice they left the cobbled street. So on this site, Bracey's, they were the first to introduce machinery. They were the first to get a steam engine. The Lettice steam ropery, Bracey complained bitterly when Lettice wanted to get a steam engine, said it was going to interfere with his rope walk. But Lettice sold out to Bracey in 1890. 1895, Bracey was looking for investors for a new limited company for what they said in the prospectus was going to be the largest rope walk on the east coast in between the Thames and Hull. But in January 1901, two of the main rope walks there close. And even in 1901, it's being characterized as a dying industry. So a picture that the museum committee bought, a vanishing industry, which was representing a rope walk. 1927, this is Mr. Mayman and his two young lads who worked for him. He was the last twine spinner east of the river. So on the other side of the river in Southtown, there was something going on, but this is about it. In the 1841 census, there was something like 240 people who were rope makers or twine spinners in Yarmouth. In the 1921 census, barely a dozen. So that's the extent of how the employment and so on had changed in the industry during that time. Lots of reasons for that. Obviously, you have steamships coming along, oil engines as well, not so many sailing ships. I mean, a sailing ship, well, HMS Victory, they always reckon needed 30 miles of cordage. And that would wear out every 2 or 3 years. So it needs constant replacing. Steamships, and you've got wire rope as well by this time. So much less requirement in the shipping industry for cordage. Now, the Gourock Rope Work Company, you'll recognize, well, Gourock is not a very local name. Obviously, it's Scottish. And they had a massive rope works plant, Port Glasgow. And this is the Lowestoft building, but they had a branch in Yarmouth as well. And it's getting to a point where these large concerns, could send rope out and canvas stuff too. And the local rope makers couldn't compete. So this is one of the other factors behind what's going on. There was another company called Frost's in London who were doing likewise. They also had a branch in Yarmouth. Okay, so let's have a quick look at Norwich. And the blue little blobs all the way around, they show some of the places around Norwich where there were rope walks and rope sites. We'll home in on one or two of them. So here's a useful address, Rope Makers Row. It's in between Drayton Road and Aylsham Road. There was a terrace of houses up there, not anymore. On the end of Rope Makers Row was the Rope Makers Arms pub. On the opposite side of the road, there was a rope walk. And the rope walk on the opposite side of the road, at the site of that, is now under a development that's called Clickers Row, which is shoe trade, which is totally different, but there we go. Rope Makers Arms, for some reason, was renamed the James I. Why on earth you name a pub after a Puritan king? No idea, but there we go. Who actually wrote things against drinking. And that's how the site is in current times. The pub's completely gone. Facade is sort of survived, and it's now a group of flats. Okay, if we move down to Lakenham, and this is Peafield Mill. Peafield, I assume it's called Peafield because when the mill was built, the area roundabout was entirely fields. It's Eleanor Road, which is off Trafford Road. And there's the mill, the red blob there. And you can see just below the mill, there is the rope walk. And the photograph shows the site where the rope walk was. Again, nothing really left, just an open green space. They did, in the early 20th century, there was a big fire on the rope walk there. It said the flames went as high as the mill. All that tar, fires on rope walks were not uncommon, and the tar was the problem rather than the raw materials. But the raw materials would go quite nicely once they've been set off by the tar. William Cox is the person who was running, the Cox family ran this rope walk. Their address is given as Scholes Green, which I think is down by, well, John Lewis, or down by Bonds, as we might call it. But if you look, bought of William Cox, and their range of products, so rope, twine, sacks, but the last one is loincloths. I thought we had sort of clothes in Norfolk by then, but anyway. So a whole range, again, rope makers, particularly the country rope makers, a whole range of canvas goods as well as ropes. Another famous name in Norwich, Hearns. The sign is in the Museum of Norwich, and the photograph is of their rope walk, well, part of their rope walk site out at Higham. So the main shop and showroom and storage was in Dove Street in Norwich. Founded 1812, Isaac Hearn was the founder of the company, and he handed the company on to his sons. There was George, who was in the business to start with, and then Daniel Hearn, whose name was the longest associated with the company. And originally they had a rope walk that was somewhere behind the Eagle in Newmarket Road, but that land was sold off for redevelopment. They moved around and they fetched up just off Arms Street and Hot Black Road in Norwich. And they made a huge range of things. They had a separate works in Toonland, which made canvas goods, wagon covers and that kind of thing. Now, I was delighted to discover that Hearns make bell ropes. They made church bell ropes. And so this advertisement, a ringing publication called the Bell News, with an advert for Hearns, and always in their adverts, their ropes were celebrated. Very important term, celebrated church bell rope manufacturer. Maker to the principal churches in Norfolk, Suffolk, Warwickshire, etc. And they did have business that sort of in various parts of the country. 1876 is the first advert I found for Hearns in the local newspaper. There was one in the Norfolk Chronicle. Even their first advert said celebrated. They had a list of products. The bottom product in the list the week before was swimming collars. And then the next week, the swimming collars disappear and celebrated church bell ropes appear instead in the list of things. Perhaps by October, it got too cold for swimming, I don't know. And in 1893, there was a huge bell project at St. Peter Mancroft in Norwich, and Hearns supplied the ropes for that. And by the reports, it seems they were well received. And I was even more delighted to come across this lovely flyer. So, and this came courtesy of a bell ringer down in Kent, who I hope is in the online audience today. So thank you very much. And why chime the bells so merrily? Why seem ye all so gay? 'Tis because the ropes were bought at Hearns the other day. The make is good, the price is small, the ringers justly own. They far surpass in quality all worsted tufting known. Then go to Hearns and buy the ropes. Hearns is the place to deal. For all confess his ropes are best to ring a merry peal. Now, there's no date on the flyer. All I do know is that in 1895, there was a special edition of the Norfolk Chronicle, which used this very same drawing as part of the advert. And that advert was there because there was a thing called the Church Conference that moved around the country every year, and it was held in Norwich that year. And church suppliers would often advertise in such things. So the worsted tufting, that's the woolly bit of the rope that ringers call the sally. But you may be aware of the big fire in Dove Street. 1898. And the fire started at Hearn's premises in Dove Street. So we're looking down Dove Street, Pottergate is at the far end, and we're looking at it from the bit where the Tesco Metro isn't anymore, if you know your Norwich. Huge fire. And Chamberlain's, the drapers, were next door. So things getting going in Hearn's, Chamberlain's wasn't going to last very long. Even more so, the Guildhall Library, 60,000 books nearly went in the Guildhall Library. Goodness knows, there must have been some real treasures in that collection. And the following Friday, the pub, the Edinburgh pub at the end of the road near Pottergate, just collapsed. Not quite sure why. It may have been water damage. It may have just have been that the lath and plaster building wasn't very strong. One of those really horrible coincidences, though, you will be aware that one of the reasons that we're in this building now is because of the huge fire at the Central Library in Norwich in 1994, which was also on the 1st of August. And I believe that the fire, there was another big fire at the shop in Norwich, also 1st of August. So be careful. Hearn's didn't waste much time in planning new premises. In fact, the fire was on the Saturday. They advertised in the fire was on the Monday. They advertised in the Saturday paper that they got temporary premises in Exchange Street, kind of opposite Jarrold's, pretty much. And then they got on with planning a new building in Dove Street, the opposite side of the road from where they had been. And interesting, looking at this collection of plans, it's not on this either of these, but land referred to as belonging to a Mr. Thorne. If you know Thorne's, so been around a long time, some of those names. And that was the new premises that were built. And that's the building as it is at the moment. So new shop, opposite side of Dove Street, and it connected through to Exchange Street. So you've got shop fronts on two sides. Exchange Street particularly useful because it was opposite the Corn Hall, where lots of farmers would come in to conduct their business. Daniel Hearn died on the 13th of July 1900, so about 2 years after the fire, and his sons took on the building, or took on the business. And I'm sure that one of the sons who was most heavily involved had been planning the building, because his name is all over the plan, all over the applications for planning and such like. So the sons were Orlando and Cornelius, and there was a younger son who was called Horatio Garibaldi. So they didn't mess about with names. Inside the shop, you can see a real cornucopia of items in there, all sorts of stuff. But look at the detail, the lavish fittings. So Cornelius Hearn, Corny Hearn, big celebrations in 1912 because the company is celebrating its centenary. And wonderful rope spinning record, 183,000 miles, it says. And what you've got to reckon with is that you may have spun 183,000 miles of yarn and rope and whatever, but he had to walk back to start again. So doing his 10,000 steps a day, no problem with that whatsoever. So there were celebration dinners and all the rest of it. Things were not as good as they may have seemed, though, because a year later, there's a bankruptcy hearing. Now, you saw the lavish fittings. I think he was, well, it was 2 years before the bankruptcy hearing, 2 or 3 years before the bankruptcy hearing, before the company even had any proper accounts. After 100 years, they weren't keeping regular accounts. He also had a bit of an indulgence in property speculation. Suspect he was taking the money for that out of the business too. So things really not good. And so it was that Corney Hearn lost control of the business, the Daniel Hearn business did carry on, but you'll see it says H. Hines and Sons Incorporated. And what they'd done is they'd taken over Hines, which was the major competitor in Norwich, not for any good business reason, but just to get rid of the competition. So he was spending money hand over fist without any real sort of calculation of exactly what he was doing. 1914, a trade directory. And so we've got Daniel Hearn and Sons Limited now. This is the old company, so Exchange Street and Dove Street, wagon covers, ropes, and all the rest of it in their advert. But in the same trade directory, what do we find? Corney Hearn and Company. So he's now set up in Exchange Street. The site of that shop would have been somewhere in what's now Gerald's front window, but bang opposite the Exchange Street premises of the Daniel Hearn Company. Things, however, didn't last, as you might think. So in 1923, there is a hearing in the county court. It was all to do with rates. There'd been some fiddle going on because of how he was paying his rates. Workman Director's savings loss. That was Mr. Hales. Mr. Hales had had a long association with the Hearns, put up a lot of money. In fact, it seems that Corney Hearn had put about £110 into the business, and Mr. Hales put 400 odd pounds into the business and seems to have lost out. Whereas Corney Hearn did survive and to fight another day a little bit. It seems that from the beginning to end, Hearn was, as a director of the company, guilty of absolute negligence. That was the judge's verdict. And the judge had previously said he didn't like to make harsh comments about the people who appeared in his court. So, but I think he let him have it on that one. 1921, a rope walk up for sale. This is the one that belonged to Daniel Hearn, and this is the rope walk that was out at Higham. So 3/4 of an acre. There was a tiled rope walk, a dressing warehouse. That's where you would prepare your fibre for spinning. A petrol store. By that time they got engines and things there. And so Daniel Hearn, they were going out of making rope. And that's the site. So you've got Arms Street, Northumberland Road, and to the left of it, as you're looking, that is Hoplack Road. And if we look now, the site actually is still there from Google Maps. It's now the site of the Wensum Community Centre. So the site has survived, rope making hasn't. And that, I think, when that one closed down, that was pretty much the end of rope making in Norwich. Now, back to Yarmouth. So this building called the Rope Walk is a kind of souvenir of rope making in Yarmouth. Don't think it's actually on a rope walk, but the name anyway is there. And as you go around the country, have a look out for street names. So the rope walk, the top right one, that's actually Bideford. The Ropery Road, that's Ilfracombe. The rope walk at the bottom right, that's Ipswich. And don't forget Cable Street, you might have heard of that one, which is named for the big rope walks that were around that area in the East End of London. So all of those names, look out for them when you're there, but don't be fooled by Ropes Walk in Blowfield, because that development was built on a field that was owned by a farmer called Mr. Rope. So I mentioned that we started with the school visits and things that we did, and lots of kind people have been very helpful along the way. So if you have any ancestors who were rope makers, they had a hard physical life out in the open air, lots of walking about, lots of work to do, but very, very, very little trace left.